Welcome to the show, Daniele.
Thank you very much for having me.
First of all, for my listeners, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I grew up in Italy, in Milan. I moved to Los Angeles around the time when I was 18 years old. I've lived now for over 30 years in Southern California. I'm not in LA anymore, but I'm fairly close by. And after a while, let's see, what did I get into? I did college out here in US. I eventually started teaching history in college, and I still do. I wrote 4 books so far. And then through a series of random coincidences that really make no sense, I ended up as a guest on Joe Rogan's podcast. I think that was my first appearance on podcasting, which was rather weird and strange. And, that gave me because I got to deep dive on the very deep end of the pool of podcasting in terms of audience. I realized, wow, lots of people listen to podcasts. That's kind of crazy. And that gave me an appreciation of podcasting that I had no idea what podcasting was. This was back in 2011 or something. And so eventually I started podcasting on my own, starting my own podcast because I had enough people who were telling me to do so. I started with a podcast called The Drunken Taoist that's more like chatty and interviews and stuff like that. Basically with no fixed topic. It was pretty much whatever I felt like chatting about. Eventually I shifted, realizing, okay, I do teach history in university. One of my favorite podcasts of all is Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. I am podcasting already. I might as well combine these things that I do and start a history podcast. And that's how I eventually created History on Fire back in 2015. It's funny from going to I want to podcast to creating History on Fire, because the amount of research that goes into a history podcast is a completely different beast from doing any other podcast where you just sit down and chat with fairly minimal preparation. It took me a year and a half of research before I ever got to the place where I could release the first episode, because, I wanted to have a few episodes in a row already prepared. And the reality was that there were so many of them that I had to, so many books you have to read, so many notes you have to take, that I was like, oh my God, what did I get myself into? This is a lot of work. But eventually I got it started, and then I started going well pretty early on, and, and I've had fun with it, and I still have fun with it. So it's, I've been doing that, for the past almost 9 years now.
When I started this podcast and I wanted to do art history podcast chronologically,
Yep.
One of the first episodes that I did was an hour, and it took me almost a month to write it.
Yep.
And now I decided to do a shorter version, one art piece per episode.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it will take me 20 years just to cover one small area of Europe.
Absolutely.
I had this colleague of mine, she's an artist, and she gave me the idea to interview other artists because there is not a lot of podcast only for the artist. And I started it, and it's weird. It's growing, but
you're there in your house with a microphone and create something, and all of a sudden you're like, seriously, there's somebody who downloaded this in Mongolia and listened to it? You're really brings home the far-reaching effects of technology for once in a pleasant way. You're like, wow, this is kind of cool. I got to do this in my house, and somebody across the globe is listening to this. It's a fun feeling.
I was thinking a few days ago how much the technology changed, because if this was happening, let's say, 300 years ago, people from Europe didn't even know where Tanzania is, or there was no communication, and not to talk about even further in time.
Yep.
Anyway, what I wanted to say to my listeners, that I really enjoyed your episodes about Michelangelo Caravaggio and about Cellini, both, how will I say, Italians? How will I put it to be respectful? Because they're thugs. Let's say they're thugs.
They are thugs. Yes. Yeah.
Caravaggio, if he lived today, I think he would be a great director.
Agreed. That was actually what Martin Scorsese said once. He said Caravaggio would have been a cinema genius, fantastic director, because of his ability to compose a scene, his eye for color. Caravaggio was a genius. Cellini, I've seen his stuff less. I'm not quite as familiar with so many of his artwork. I know some, and he's clearly extremely skilled. Both of them were incredible. Caravaggio in particular, I absolutely love. And both of them lived insane lives. They lived rather violent lives, very illegal lives in lots of ways. Both of them ended up in jail. Both of them ended up getting into fights, killing people with swords. It's a rather I don't know what the right word is. I guess rather intense lives, to put it mildly.
But also in the same time, Caravaggio could produce such a beautiful painting full of thought and deep insights and also go around and going into the sword fights. So I guess maybe he was a very complex person, unknown until early 1900s. Only in a few churches his paintings were hanged. And I studied art since I was 14. I didn't go to regular school. I went to art school. So it's a little bit different in Southern Europe how art is appreciated. So instead of mathematics, I had geometry, or instead of language, I had literature. And when I first encountered Italian Renaissance and these who came before them and a little bit later, there's hundreds and hundreds of artists who changed how we see art in Europe. And when we think about Renaissance in Italy, and it was so violent in the same time. What do you think? Why is that?
I mean, it's interesting. It's sometimes, and I don't want to make a cause and effect thing, because sometimes it's more complicated than that, but definitely chaotic times sometimes tend to spur creativity, because probably people are looking for ways out of like the messy circumstances that they are living in. And I mean, a lot of the creativity of the Renaissance, at least the late Renaissance, let's put it that way, because again, there is no single cause for something like the Renaissance. But like the latter part of the Renaissance, toward the end, a lot of it has to do with the clash between Catholics and Protestants, and the church putting massive amount of money in creating amazing works of art to sort of seduce people to still be attached to the Catholic Church and not to the Protestants. That's the latter part. Earlier on had other reasons, but it became a factor. So you have these, you look at the 1500s, it's religious conflicts left, right, and center between Catholics and Protestants, and somehow those terrible religious conflicts help create and fund some fantastic art. So you get like these unintended consequences that sometimes pop up from terrible times, from warfare and conflict and all of that. Like if you think about, for example, roughly about 2,600 years ago, it was an extremely messy period in China. And that's what created a lot of the philosophy that China went by. Like Taoism and Confucianism were both born as responses to the chaos of the times. So I do think that sometimes, while I wouldn't make it as you need chaos to create something amazing, for a good piece of Nietzsche, who had a line actually about you still need a chaos inside of yourself to give birth to a dancing star. That was one of his lines. But like, I don't think that's strictly necessary. I think it's definitely possible to create a beautiful art and beautiful thing in the middle of more peaceful context. But there's something to be said about living in messy times as something that stimulates creativity.
So I guess we will create such a good art these days.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, the world is a mess right now.
Yeah.
Do you often travel to Italy?
More or less every year.
I was listening to your, I don't know how to pronounce his name, the swordsman of Japan.
Miyamoto Musashi.
I will not even try. I didn't know about him until I think you spoke on one of the episodes with Joe Rogan.
Mm-hmm.
And I started exploring that. And I came to find out this other dude that is called Yasuke.
Yeah. Of course. African samurai.
Are you ever going to think about making an episode about him?
I did a mini episode about him. Like I do a few, what I do is I do the big full-length episodes that I release regularly. Mm-hmm. And then sometime I release mini episodes that are more anywhere from like 15 to 45 minutes and then I just put on like Patreon or Substack just for supporters. And Yasuke was one of those where I was like, I really want to cover this story. A bunch of people ask me about that story. The problem was the more I looked into it, the more the stuff we know for a fact could be summed up in 3 minutes. So even expanding to a little bit of context, a little bit of guesswork, I was like, there's no way I got a full episode out of this story. We just don't know enough stuff about his life, you know? Did end up creating a mini episode. I forget how long it was. It was probably about half hour, something like that, where I was like, okay, I have enough for a half-hour episode. I can do that. And I had a good time. But yeah, it was one of those where there's the known historical facts are very, very few. And then there's a bit of legend around him. And of course, the fascination for this wild tale. And it happens more often than you would think, where I run into a story that I'm like, this story is amazing. And then I start researching and I'm like, it is amazing, but it's based on like 3 lines of facts. It's like there's not enough to build a full tale out of it, you know?
I understand that because when I read this story that I couldn't find in any books except one small reference about this lady in, I think, Normandy. An English king killed her husband, so she sold all of her castles, everything, made boats, and went on the killing spree against English. And that was it. I wish there was more to it.
It happens a lot. There are characters in history that sometime, I mean, you know, even Swam, where I did get like full episodes out of, at some point I did this full episode about this Chinese lady who in the beginning of the 1800s, she commanded the biggest pirate fleet in history. And, you know, she was not 10,000 years ago. She was beginning of the 1800s in China, so a highly literate place. You would figure there would be sources about her everywhere. And really, there wasn't a whole lot. You know, I eventually could create a full episode by stretching it, not just about her biography, but piracy in China in the late 1700s, early 1800s, the conditions that caused it, the government respect. You know, by providing enough context, I could do a full episode. But when you look about her life, and I'm sure it was an amazing life, because the stuff we do know, it really boggles the mind.
Yeah.
But, you know, if I only went by what we know about her, I can tell you the story in about 5 minutes.
So that brings me to the maid, the Joan of Arc.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Maybe I heard from you, or maybe I read it in some books. I don't remember. We know more about her, a little peasant girl from 1400s, than we know about her king of France.
Yep.
That's a crazy story. Do you want to share some next project that you're working on, or?
Sure. So the very next thing that's coming out, I think later in February, and it's 2-part, one in February and one in March, I think. I'm doing a 2-part series that's heavy. It's a bit on the dark side because it's about the civil war in El Salvador in the 1970s and 1980s. Dark, really, really, really dark. I mean, originally I was planning to do only one episode about this one massacre of this group of peasants who had nothing to do with anything, but in the context of the Cold War, there was no room for neutrality. So if you're not with the government, you might as well be guerrilla because we'll treat you like such. And but then the more I started researching, the more I started getting a lot of the background, and in particularly the story of this one guy named Oscar Romero, who was Bishop of El Salvador. He was elected to the job of Archbishop because he was a pretty conservative guy, and so the bosses in El Salvador felt safe with him. But once he became Archbishop, his eyes kind of opened to the fact that the horrors happening around him. And he started being very vocal, condemning the death squads, condemning the government, condemning all of this stuff, knowing that the odds of getting killed over there were extremely high. You know, anybody who spoke up against the government at the time in El Salvador got a bullet in the head. And, you know, there's even a moment where he wrote a letter to the U.S. president at the time saying, please stop giving money to my government because they are just financing death squads, massacring people left, right, and center. And, you know, the U.S. president ignored the letter, and like 2 weeks later, the doors to the church opened when he was celebrating Mass, and they just shot him at that moment. He eventually became a saint for the Catholic Church, which I thought he was bizarre because while he was alive, the church was definitely giving him a hard time. in some way, it was a great story to see this guy, like really heroic quality of this guy who just knew that he was going to pay a price and accepted it. And that was part of the deal. And I spent a lot of time talking about him, giving a broader context. And so then that's the first episode. And then the second one, I get into the specific story of this massacre. In my mind, there were a lot of policies passed in the name of fighting against communism that actually help keep communism alive much longer than it should have. Because the reality is that when you think about some Salvadorian peasant, he doesn't care about Marxism or communism, does not spend his nights reading about Karl Marx theories, All he knows is that he's starving and that he wants his kids not to starve. And when he goes to ask the bosses if they can throw him a bone and make things slightly easier, the response is to send death squads to kill his whole family. These were policies that were supported by the US government at the time in the name of we need to crack down against communism, which, okay, you can make an argument for that, but then the thing was like anything that is not an ultra-conservative version of politics is equal to communism. And it's like, no, wait, time out, But in my mind, the fact that they block any attempt at reform, they block any other option, essentially push a whole bunch of people in the hands of communist guerrilla, people who would have never embraced communism otherwise. Part of my thesis there is that a bunch of policies official in the name of fighting communism actually empowered communism much more than, like, different policies would have taken the wind out of communism sails much easier and much better. And instead, these caused a lot of bloodshed and wasn't that effective. Yeah, when you look at times like that, it's, in some way, actually, there's another series that I released a while back, but I never got released in the open. It was always behind the paywall, and I'm going to get to release soon, and I'm excited about. That's about the Italian resistance in World War II during under fascism. And both of those are extremely personal episodes, because I have one is primarily about my grandmother who was a teenager and she became a partisan, and like the stories about her in World War II are pretty crazy. And I do mention also my grandfather, his experience. And then another one is actually not directly related, he's a friend. I guess he's my mom's husband's father, who recently died at like 96 or something. And he was the head of this partisan group who was, they were the ones who stopped Mussolini's escape and captured him. And so there's a crazy story about resistance in the mountains and the clash with Mussolini and all of that. And so I'm doing a couple of episodes about that, because, you always hear about World War II. It's always a story of armies fighting one another. I was fascinated with the idea of people who were fighting in World War II, but they were not in a uniform, and the battlefield was not somewhere far away. The battlefield was outside their door every time they stepped out in the city. I remember like my grandma growing up, like I would see her and she had a bit of a pessimistic, negative vibe, and I couldn't figure out what's up with her. And then, there are things that nobody ever told me, and eventually I put two and two together. Like I remember taking me to play basketball as a little kid to this one stadium in Milan. And then many years later, I read that in that stadium, some of her friends have been captured and executed right there. And she would have been executed right there had she been captured. And so I'm thinking what it must do to somebody to spend your whole life in a place where everywhere you turn, there are memories of PTSD. There are memories like, you can't even take your grandson to a basketball game without seeing, right there is where your friends got sprayed with bullets. It messes with your head.
Fuck it. I can tell you. Fuck. When I grew up in besieged Sarajevo and my parents are from Srebrenica, a small town in eastern Bosnia, 11 kilometers away from the Serbian border. That tells you a lot.
Yeah.
And the war happened. We all had our stories and we never talked about it. And we grew up never talking about it. But when I moved to Sweden, it is funny now when I think about it. And it even then was funny. I was going to the forest, just enjoying beautiful Swedish forest. And then in the back of my head, oh, you're in a minefield. And I had to retract all of my steps back just to realize that I'm in Sweden. You understand?
Yeah.
And I was walking in that time with my girlfriend in this beautiful, beautiful, serene piece of land with the sea, and it was sunny, and the Swedish people were bathing, and I was like, fuck, no, I ain't gonna bathe. This is too cold. Well, I will tell you now that I'm bathing as well. It takes time to adjust. In Sweden, there is in the middle of the summer, they call it midsummer. They have this festivity when they celebrate summer.
Yep.
And it was beautiful. I didn't know that there was a military base close to the place where we were, and they had planes for the festival or for something. They went really fast, really low, and I was with a bunch of, I have to say, Italians and Swedish people, and I jumped into the bushes because I panicked.
Of course.
Because they were all psychologists, both Italians and Swedish. I became almost like a test bunny or something.
Of course.
They wanted to know more, and
of course.
And I closed even more because they were on to me.
Yeah.
And then when I have my own daughter now, it's totally different thinking. Never to happen. I will never allow myself to what happened. You see, I have a still problem expressing. So
sure, of course.
Yeah, so when I see my daughter, I have a totally different set of feelings about the world and how to protect it and what. Yep. Just speaking about it, it's like, ugh. So that's why I decided to write my novel in English, and it gives me a little bit of a distance, so I can.
Yep.
Because if I would write it on Bosnian, I would never finish it.
Yeah.
Even in English, even that I have this language distance that I can see something objectively, it took me 15 years.
Oh, of course. I mean, it's like, and don't get me wrong, I don't do just episodes about terrible traumas, like sometimes, but that's the reality. Is like, part of the reason why we look at those things is because the traumas are like, as human beings, we're fascinated by how do you get around these things that scar your soul? How do you survive things that maybe you can physically survive but are trying to crush you emotionally? And so I think that's part of, it's not like is not an outrage or fear porn where you're just doing it for the sake. You're doing it because there's a lesson in that stuff. There's a lesson in learning how to survive terrible things and learning how do people adapt? How do people move around these traumas? Just to tell you, okay, I'm not just doing horrible things. So one that I'm having fun that I just finished researching that is probably going to be toward the end of 2024. Yeah, it's an episode that I want to do about these two very different saints. One in the Catholic tradition with St. Francis of Assisi, who was a wild guy because he grew up fairly wealthy in the middle of Italy, gave out every piece of money he ever had, and lived a life of voluntary poverty, helping the poor, which was a kind of a weird thing to do. The church didn't know what to do with him, whether to consider him a heretic or consider him a saint. But then the other guy, he gets even wilder and more interesting because he's considered a saint in Tibet and Bhutan. And he's this guy by the name of Drupa Kunli. And Kunli had this, he's known as the saint of 5,000 women because he's very much like another story that I cover of Ikkyu Sojun, the Zen monk. Kunli was, he liked to drink, he liked Buddhism, and he liked women. And, the reality is that probably there's a mountain of folklore that has been added to the real historical guy. He was probably a little bit tamer than this, but the folklore has grown out of control on this character and is absolutely beloved in Bhutan and Tibet. The stories are absolutely hilarious, even ones that clearly are probably made up about him. But it's interesting to me that people choose to believe them, whether they are real or not. And they've added to this body of knowledge on the stories of this wild, crazy saint. And I thought it was an interesting parallel to look at these two guys who clearly live very, St. Francis of Assisi lived as a celibate guy. Drupa Kunli was having sex with everything that moved and sometimes didn't. And, it's just like, it was fascinating to look at what's considered a saint in different cultures. None of these guys ever killed anybody. They weren't at war. It was a much tamer episode. And, some time to break. When I have too many in a row that are a little on the heavy side, it's nice to break the rhythm with something that reminds you, okay, history doesn't always mean war and bloodshed and terrible things. There's another way to do history as well.
But we are all driven towards these characters who are not tamed.
Sure.
I have to ask you, because I'm curious, what draws you to these characters and how do you approach in telling these stories?
I think pretty much every character I enjoy covering is somebody who's grappled with his demons. Is somebody who definitely has, if we want to put it in modern terms, is somebody who has issues. Is somebody who has some very heightened sensitivity, which can be a blessing and a curse, because when you're a very sensitive human being, when you have a high degree of empathy, when you have things around you really affect you emotionally, it can be a blessing or a curse. It often is a curse because you're bombarded by things that overwhelm you and you don't know how to handle them. Or if you learn to ride those waves, it can be a blessing because now you can understand other human beings in the way that most people who don't have that degree of empathy and sensitivity cannot. And so you can also help other human beings to a different level. You can be a greater artist. You can be, because you are in touch with a certain sensitivity that most normal people don't have. So I'm fascinated with people who clearly are born with something slightly different in terms of sensitivity. And it's not that you are a better or worse person. I'm not even assigning a value judgment, but you are more. And more is not, again, good or bad. But more can be worse if more is directed in the wrong direction. But it's just your emotional range is wider. You feel things to a level that seem to be deeper than how other people respond. And I'm interested in seeing how people deal with that, how people deal with being born on this giant emotional wave that if they don't learn to ride it, they end up at the bottom of the ocean. And they have to figure out a way to ride it, but it's a very hard thing. And so how somebody who deals with those things, how they deal with tragedy, how they deal with difficulties and drama. And, the difficulty and drama is not, again, because I'm addicted to those things. I couldn't care less. I'm just interested in how do they come out from the other side in the face of these challenges. It's not all I do, but it's definitely a big element of the characters that I'm naturally drawn to.
You spoke about empathy. How do you view the role of empathy in understanding historical events and historical characters?
I mean, that's even the reason why, honestly, I think people like listening to History on Fire, because I try to put people there. I try to make them see reality the way somebody at that time did. So I'm not just telling you, the economic condition of the 1500s led to this and that. It's like, sure, there's that, and that's important too. But unless you care about the people we're talking about the big picture, impersonal forces, it's not that interesting. People want to see history through the eyes of somebody. They want to feel what it must have been like. And of course, some of it is, it's guesswork. Some of it we don't know. But I want to try to go as close as possible to bring you there so that you are emotionally invested in what you're hearing rather than just hearing some information that may or may not be relevant to your life.
Do you have a favorite historical character that resonates with you personally, on personal level?
I think my all-time favorite, and it's funny because so many of my podcasts have conflict and fighting and this, and my favorite does not. And it's a two-part series that I did about this guy, EQ. EQ was a Zen monk in the 1400s. And I love that guy because he lived through very tumultuous times and civil war in Japan and all of this stuff. And EQ managed to just have a blast of a life. Despite all the rough things he had to deal with, a very difficult childhood, this, that, and the other, the guy had created a really, I hate to use the word just happy because it sounds almost superficial, but it's not. It's actually a conquest to find happiness in a messy world. He managed to live a great, happy life. He was hilarious. He was really funny. he indirectly ended up having a huge impact on the culture of Japan by affecting pretty much every other art form, since so many of the people following him were people who then played a key role in anything from painting to theater to tea ceremony to Zen gardens to, all kinds of art forms were affected by his philosophy and his worldview, because again, many of the leading figures that affected Japanese history revolved around this entourage and were influenced by his philosophy. Wow, what a life. The guy in the midst of all sort of drama, he managed to just live a great life. I love the fact that he wasn't blind to the reality of suffering around him, but a lot of it was an insistence on finding something to be happy about, even while acknowledging the horror around you. Like there's a great line that, one of my favorite lines in all of history, where EQ has this line that says, "Throw me into hell and I'll find a way to enjoy it." And so he's not the guy who's denying, like who's delusional, who's saying, no, there is no hell. Like we can make everything wonderful. Just think positive and it's all going to be great. He's like, no, there are conditions that are absolutely horrible. So there's an acknowledgement there of like, there are situations that there's no way to spin it. They are terrible, plain and simple. But EQ thing is, his challenge is, okay, I may end up in the middle of it. I'm going to find a way to enjoy it, which of course is way easier said than done. And, you're going to feel more time than you succeed at something like that. But the willingness, the desire to just not let the external conditions of life crush you, to have that defiance, to still look for the smile, the happiness, the thing. I was like, this guy is my hero. I love this guy. And then, never mind, it doesn't hurt that, like Drupa Kunli, he was a big fan of women and drinking. And I'm like, I can relate to that. I can agree with that. And so it's pretty funny. He lived a really long life. He ended up having this crazy love story. That's one of the most celebrated love story in Japanese history, where he was in his 70s. Is like, it's a cartoon character. Like if you didn't know it was real, you would be like, come on, this is a literary character that got made up. It's too perfect in so many ways.
I enjoyed that episode. How important is storytelling in history?
I think it's huge. Otherwise, nobody cares, and for good reasons. Everything we do is about stories, right? Everything, whether it's a song, whether it's a history podcast, people want to be entertained. We like stories. So that's how we learn things, is through stories. So to me, that's, unless you do good storytelling, you can have the most accurate and well-documented history in the world, and nobody will want to read it, which is often what happens when professional historians write history. It's a pain to go through those books because they are poorly written usually, and convoluted, and poor storytelling. And then you get a journalist to write history. And if they stick to the standards of good history, which is well documented, you don't tweak the facts to tell a better story. But the way they tell a story is 100 times more engaging than the way sometimes the professional does. Because they understand that a story doesn't just need to be accurate. Yes, it does. That's an important part, but also need to be engaging. Otherwise, nobody cares. And I feel that that's extremely important. Like, if I didn't do that, nobody would be listening to History of Fire. I was thinking about it today as I was walking my fierce dog, Azog the Defiler.
It was a poodle, by the way.
Yeah, it was a tiny little Maltese. Yeah, but yes, close enough.
Sorry.
He's going to take deep offense at being called a poodle, I'm sure. I don't even know what he is, honestly. I think he's Maltese, but he's a rescue dog, so who knows? He was found on the street. But like, as I was walking my dog, I was thinking that's the one downside of History on Fire. It sort of took away my pleasure for reading, because I read so many awful books on a regular basis. And I mean awful in the, they are important books. They form the basis of what I need to know in order to tell history, because I need to really document myself. And those are the guys who do the job, who went digging through sources, who check all the archives, who did all this and that. But when you read the books, they are anything but engaging. They are dry. They are really painful to read. And the fact that I have to read so many of those and I don't have a whole lot of time to read for pleasure, that's the only part that bothers me, that I'm like, man, I used to read for pleasure. I don't really get to do that much anymore because I'm reading so much because I have to. But then again, on the other hand, if these guys were good storytellers, I would be out of a job with History on Fire, because then there wouldn't be any need for me to repackage the information in a way that's a little more engaging to listen to.
But how do you see the role of history podcast in shaping public interest and understanding the past? Because I'm afraid that if it's sensationalized, then it becomes almost like a Hollywood film that has nothing to do with the history.
That's why I walk a very fine line, because I don't think it's actually that fine, because to me it's like there's nothing that I bring up on a history podcast that's not well documented. And if I do bring up something that may or may not be true, I'll tell you right off the bat. I'll be like, okay, this is what we know for sure about this guy. This is what some people argue based on this somewhat incomplete evidence. So I'll present it to you. You choose to believe what you want. Maybe this happened, maybe this is folklore and is a legend that grew out of the story of this guy's life. And in many cases, we don't know. We can take educated guesses about what happened, but we don't really know. And so I'm very upfront about keeping it real, being honest with, I'm not tweaking the story to make it sound good. I mean, maybe I'll read something and I'm like, oh, that's such a fantastic tale. And then I look at the evidence, I'm like, probably not real, probably a legend that grew out around it. But I can say it. I'll be like, hey, this is likely a legend, but it's interesting that people chose to believe it, and this is what evidence we have for it, which may or may not convince you. And I just present it for what it is. So I'm not streamlining a story to make it more sensational, that word, the one about making something more exciting. It's more about just going with these are the sources we have. This is what we do know and we do not know. This is what some people argue. This is what some people choose to believe. I take it very seriously that while I want my podcast to be entertaining, it's still history. It's not me fictionalizing history. That to me is a separate thing. And that's why, for example, we're talking about novels. I have been writing a historical fiction about Caravaggio's life, and that one is fictionalized. So there's at least half of the book is made up. It's me imagining things of what I think would be plausible. Like I want it to be plausible, but at the end of the day, it's a fictional creation based on history. So I want to be very clear that if you're looking for the historical Caravaggio, that's not the place to look. That's my Caravaggio, it's my version of it. If you want to look at the history, get the podcast that I did on Caravaggio. That's historical. I like to be very clear about expectations. Yeah, it's based on history, but it's fiction. If I'm doing a history podcast, that's history. I like to make it clear for people who listening the difference between the two. When you are going off into fantasy land and when it is based on hard facts.
When your character of Caravaggio is doing what he's doing, are you repeating everything that he did in real life plus something?
Sure. There is real life. There are events that I'm like, sure, he did this and he did that and did that. But in between, there's so much more. Like, for example, we know that Caravaggio was something happened to him early in life where he had a very difficult relationship with authorities. He did not like the police. He did not like the church. And he clearly had some kind of PTSD. We don't know why. My job when I do the fiction part is I create a backstory. Like the first 50, 60 pages of the book are entirely made up, other than the fact that I think there's one line in one of his biographers that mentioned that when he was in Milan, he had to flee Milan because of a murder involving a cop, a rich man, and a prostitute. And that's all we know. 2 lines in these sources that live. Wow. And so then I build a whole thing about those elements. And I have a 60-page thing that describes, do I think that what I'm writing happened? No, of course not. It's just me, and nobody will ever know what really happened. It's me making up what to me is an interesting tale based on those elements that leads to Caravaggio being as weird as we historically know he was.
So sort of like Irving that made a book about Van Gogh.
Mm-hmm. There are different kinds of historical fiction. Some historical fiction are like, they are creating dialogue, which of course they weren't there for, but they are essentially going almost by the book in terms of historical events. They don't add anything. They just add and this is how the sky was that day, and he said this, which of course none of those things you really know. But, you're keeping purely historical facts. Then there are some that also add historical facts that may or may not have happened at all, but you are filling in the blanks between event A that we do know is historical, event B that we do know is historical, but there's so much in between, and you're just making stuff up. So that's a different kind of historical fiction where the fiction part, rather than being like 80 history, 20 fiction, it becomes more 50-50 or even 40-60. And that's fine too. I think as long as it's clear what people are getting, as long as they know what they are getting, I think you can do whatever you want in the balance between fiction and history.
Speaking of that, how do you feel about when there's a film, especially in Hollywood, when they're claiming to be a history and it's clearly not?
That's the problem when, to me, it's like, don't claim to be history, or claim to be history. Like, if you want history, there are documentaries. That's history, where you base it strictly on evidence. If you are doing a movie, I don't think it's a good idea for anybody to claim a fiction movie is history. Even if it's the 80-20 kind, where, it's mostly historical and you're just adding a few things, because the reality is that you're going to usually end up adding a lot. And I mean, I always thought it was really weird how Ridley Scott now, when he did Napoleon,
I didn't see it.
I didn't see it either, but he was getting mad at the criticism about, man, your Napoleon has very little to do with what we know as the historical Napoleon. And rather than saying the obvious, which he would have been right, which was like, hey, man, this is a fiction thing. It's like, if you want history, read the damn book or look at a documentary. This is my Napoleon. It's not the historical. And he would have been right. He didn't do that. He went off going on about, how would historians know anyway what the reality is? It's messy, it's complicated. You don't know either. And it's just like, that's dumb, because of course there are rules for evidence and what we do in history. And while you don't know exactly 100%, it's, just be honest when you're fictionalizing stuff. I don't think there's a problem doing that. Just say it, that it's fiction. That's it.
My field of historic interest is period of fall of Roman Empire till about birth of Renaissance in Europe. That's my favorite part of history. And of course, I'm living in Scandinavia now. But when TV series, doesn't matter what it's called, people can put two and two together. When they claim that two historical figures that are separate by 300 years claim to be brothers, and then one character that never been to England comes to England and events that are like centuries before he was even born. And then I don't know what those producers and writers thought about it. And they are, of course, American TV shows. And I will often wonder, how would Americans feel if a European filmmaker would put George Washington and Theodore Roosevelt together, fighting slavery together in a civil war?
And that's where, to be like, I don't know if you remember, there was years ago, there was a movie that cracked me up. It was, I forgot if this was the title. It was Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Hunter.
Oh, yeah.
You get that, where it's like the Civil War was really a fight against vampires. At that point, go that route, and it's funny, or the Quentin Tarantino route of like, Hitler was killed in a bombing in a Parisian theater. He's making shit up left and right, and it's fine, again, as long as we're clear. At some point, is like, to me, though, is when you change the history so much, like, when somebody, what you said, live 300 years later, you put them in a context that has nothing to do with it. It's like, why even have them as a character? Why can't you just have a fictionalized character if it's so out of time and place? And unless you're doing an intentionally ridiculous thing like Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, which is funny, and let's do that. But unless you're being intentionally ridiculous, why do that? just make up a fictional character, and that's cool, and put them in the context and make them do wild things. And
there was a few years ago a huge announcement there will be a TV show about Leonardo da Vinci.
mm-hmm.
And of course, as an art historian, as a painter myself, Leonardo is Leonardo. I promise you, after 2 minutes of watching the TV show, I turned it off. The first scene of the series was in the hill above Firenze.
Yeah.
And there was dome of the church. I don't remember what it's called right now. Finished. Like, okay, that's weird. And we all know that Leonardo da Vinci was left-handed. He was, of course, painting with the right hand in the series. And we know that he was homosexual. There was a naked woman in the middle of this serene Firenze. Yeah. Oh, okay, this is...
Yeah, I know. Was that Da Vinci's Demons?
I don't remember the name, but I was just like, no, I don't.
I saw that TV series. It was ridiculous. It was really just like, okay. At one point, Da Vinci traveled to South America and did ayahuasca. That was pretty funny.
That's wow.
Serious.
Oh.
Okay. Just like, okay, that's he got to South America before Columbus ever discovered the Americas and did ayahuasca, and I was like, that's taking historical fiction to a whole other level.
No, but why just don't put it in Narnia or something? And I don't want to take much of your time. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I have so many questions for you. But as I said, you can say, I want to go and we will finish it. I always wondered to ask somebody to explain me this, and I think you're the perfect person. How do you see people who are writing history and claiming to be history, but actually it's a fun fiction promoting certain ideals or projections of, for example, if I write about slavery and it's completely different context. Of course, slavery is bad, but context of now time and how we see it, and no historical understanding of those people who lived through these historical narratives. Maybe it's a messy question.
No, I understand what you're saying. I understand. Yeah. I think it's, and again, I think that's where it's important to be clear about intent, where if you do history, base it purely on known facts. That's it. If you are fictionalizing stuff, then it's understood that whatever you're talking about is going through your filter. And your filter can be you trying as hard as possible to stick into the facts, but fictionalizing, or it can be making up the entire thing and changing just about everything you can think of. When we are dealing with fiction, my history hat, I remove it and I'm just thinking, okay, this is just a fictional story set in history, but it's fiction. And at that point, I'm cool with just about anything as long as we're clear that that's what we're doing, that we're making stuff up. So even like, okay, in fiction, for example, if I'm going back in time and you have to describe characters, create dialogue, do all that, realism goes out the window. Because the reality is that if you were to try to, never mind that it's probably impossible, but if you were to try to talk like people back then, let alone get into their head and their values and stuff, nobody would understand it today. So I have no problem modernizing. Like if you look, for example, at like the Rome TV series that they HBO did.
Wow, yeah.
A lot of they have some Latinism and stuff, but a lot of the dialogue is very modern. And I like it. I have no problem making, like, there's an aspect of me that I enjoy making the past less remote, less out there. Even though if you want to get technical and literal, who the hell knows what those people really thought and felt like? Because we don't know that, the assumption that everybody viewed the world the same way we do today is probably almost certainly wrong. And yet we don't really know exactly how they viewed it at the time. We don't know exactly how they spoke in daily life. We don't know. You are making stuff up. And I think it's, like, for example, when I write historical fiction, my language tends to be pretty modern. And of course, if I want to have very as close to history as possible, I would never write it like that but I want to have an immediacy where somebody reading today can relate, can feel like, okay, this is a different time period with different values perhaps, but I understand some of the dynamics rather than being so far removed from the language, the attitude, the thinking that you're like, I might as well be watching documentaries about orangutans because this is so far removed from my understanding of what being a human being is on this planet that it's another beast altogether. Like that's what to me the Rome TV series did very well. Like those were characters that you could understand, even though they were rooted in some values that may not be today's exactly. You could understand, you could relate, you could get those guys. And does that mean that ancient Romans were exactly like that? Who knows? But as fiction, I enjoyed it.
I don't have a degree in history, and I don't claim to be a historian, but I wrote history, and I'm writing art history.
Yep.
And of course, there's you, who is professor, but also there is somebody like Dan Carlin, who is Dan Carlin, and leave it to that. How do you feel historians writing history and people, not journalists, but people who are maybe artists themselves and myself in this matter, how do you feel about this other bunch writing historical stories, not fictions?
I think he's good. I think he's, as long as you understand what the rules of evidence are, what constitutes actual evidence, what's not, as long as you are clear about what we know for a fact, and this is why, and what's debated because we're not entirely, as long as you understand how to use evidence, I think it's great if non-professionals do it, because often they are better storytellers. And if they are keeping the rules of evidence, they are actually end up writing better history than historians sometimes.
Speaking of history on fire, how do you think it contributes to the public awareness?
Yeah, so I think there are two sides to that. There's, in terms of why people listen, is because I end up reading, 10 books on a topic, and they are usually pretty dry books that nobody would want to read for fun. But I get to find out all the evidence that helps me put together a story. And there are little nuggets of like, this is a fantastic tale buried in the middle of a bunch of jargon and poorly written. So I take all these elements. I feel like I'm like panning for gold in the middle of a bunch of mud. And then I take out these pieces of gold and create something cool with it, where I create a narrative that's smoother, that's easier to digest, that's more relatable. But it's all based on real stuff. That's sort of the entertainment factor of it, or presenting it in a way that's more engaging. In terms of going deeper than that, I think I'm interested in stories that teach us something about life, whether it's about dealing with adversity, whether it's about why as human beings we seem to do the things we do, why do we tend to dehumanize people we disagree with politically. History to me is a giant lab with case studies that show you a bunch of experiments, where they went and what it means to be human under certain circumstances. So you learn a lot about life from studying how other people have approached when they came to a place where they could turn left, they could turn right, and the choices they made and where those choices led. I think it's a fantastic thing in terms of learning from other people's experience rather than only based on your own.
Thank you. I know that the American school system, especially public American school system, is not great on art. In Sweden, for example, it's a very cultural thing not to appreciate art. Nobody knows art because it's more working socialist country that going in a little bit different direction these days. My question for you is, how much art is important to people?
I think it's huge. And yes, some school systems are atrocious for that. I mean, honestly, American school system, based on what I've seen, universities start getting a little better. Before university, like elementary school through high school, is atrocious. It's just really, really bad. I mean, even stuff, forget art, like even my daughter was telling me they never had them open an atlas, just learning where countries are. Some kids are like, wait, is China in Asia? Like stuff like that. And you're like, Jesus, there's a level of ignorance that's embarrassing and it's systemic, where it's just really, really bad. So of course it's better when you do have a certain level of exposure and education to things early on. It's also true that schools sometimes are not the best places to fully develop that, because in many cases when you're tired school teacher who doesn't want to be there and is, has been teaching way too long and he tells you about this one thing or one event, even if it's the greatest thing on earth, you don't want to hear it from them. It's a classic thing where, they made you read a book in school and you are like, oh, Jesus, this sucks. And then you read it on your own years later and you're like, wow, this book is amazing. So there's something, I can see it both ways. Of course, it would be nice to have great school that expose you to things and educate in a better way. And I still think even when they do a poor job, it's still better to go that route than not. But of course, I also think that much of real education happens outside of schools.
So I think your podcast is very important for the audience around the world, because a lot of people never heard about John Doar or Caravaggio, and now they could listen the stories.
And it's a harder challenge in a way, because if I'm teaching in a classroom and I have 50 people in the classroom, they are a captive audience. They have to listen to me, whether I tell a great story or not, whether I'm doing a good job or not. In a podcast like that, nobody has to listen to me. I have to earn every minute of attention from people, because they must feel that what I'm doing is contributing something to their lives that's interesting. So there's a higher, harder standards that I need to meet, which also forces me to do a much better job than when I have a captive audience of people who don't want to be there.
What is the point of art?
There are many aspects to answer that. I think one aspect has to do with, almost superficially, greater enjoyment of life. Something that helps you see the world through a lens that helps you enjoy life more. In an ideal way, I would go even beyond that. And I think the stuff that I enjoy, whether it's painting, whether it's a movie, whether it's a book, whether it's a song, whether it's even a video game, it's stuff that is not just fun, which is important. I'm all for fun, but also that inspires you to live your life in a way that's kinder, that's braver, that's more heartfelt. So to me, really, and again, I don't want to oversimplify, because I don't, the role of art I think is more complicated than whatever one sentence can say. But a big element for me of the role of art is to inspire you to walk out the door and be ultimately a better human being in how you relate to other people, how you view the world, your enjoyment of it all. And that to me is the point. Otherwise, if it's just art for art's sake, much like anything else, if it's history for history's sake, if it's whatever for its own sake, I don't really care that much. I care about the impact that it has on you as a human being and how it makes you live, feel, and behave.
If you could choose one person, any historical character, even a character from a book that you like, to have a dinner with him or her, who would it be and why?
I think I go back to the EQ thing, because the guy knew how to have a great time. So I wouldn't mind sharing a glass with the guy, chatting about life and contemplating the beauty of the female form. So yes, that would be, I think EQ is my guy.
Okay, thank you. And the last question, how would you like to be remembered?
I mean, memory is a tricky thing, because that's actually a sobering thought sometimes when you realize that memory disappears, that the people who left the biggest mark in history, when you think about what their life must have been like and what we know about them now, is like 0.1% of who they were and what they did is actually remember. And even those are very few people, let alone. So to me, in some way, it's hard to think about it, because so much of what you are and care about is just not going to be remembered. It's going to go and, yeah, I don't know that there's a quick, easy answer to that. As much as humanly possible, I like for things I've done and do and will continue to do, to have an impact, so that somebody years down the road can read something I wrote or can listen to something, and maybe they are in a terrible moment in their life. Maybe they are dealing with something, maybe they are feeling, and something I created give them a moment to kind of turn around and get out of whatever mental prison they got stuck in, or find something that helped them feel better, be happier, live a better life. That to me is doesn't really get much better than that.
Thank you for agreeing to do this podcast. I'm really touched that you said yes, even though that I'm still in my nursery of podcasting. I'm beyond words how much grateful I am. I only know to say grazie and few swear words in Italian, and that's it.
Thank you so much. We definitely had a fun chat.
Yes. Ciao.
Good night.
Ciao. Bye.
This concludes this episode. We didn't know what else to say in this episode. I want to thank you for joining and listening. I hope we inspired you. I hope you learned something.